got our cylinder head all cleaned up here, and as you can see, I've got all the gasket surfaces all cleaned up. Got all that old crud and stuff out of the intake ports and everything. Removed all the carbon from the exhaust port areas there, so we're just about ready to reassemble this. But before we do, now we've got our valves all decarbonized and cleaned up real good. The last thing we want to check is our valve stem to guide clearance. I'm going to zoom in here and just show you this one is actually in good shape, and basically all you want to do is just put the valve down in there and just kind of rock it back and forth and see if you can feel excessive clearance on it. Now this little bit here, if you look very carefully, you can see this thing just barely moves, and that's about right. Of course, you got to have a little bit of clearance in there because they do have to get a little bit of oil up in there to lubricate the valve stems, or otherwise they'll gall up and just ruin the valve guides themselves. So just a little bit of play like that right there is nothing unusual. Now of course, if it was just flopping in there, then you would want to look at either replacing the cylinder head or having the valve guides replaced, which is a pretty expensive ordeal. So basically just check them, and unless it's just got just a buku miles on them, it should be pretty good shape. All right, now we'll go ahead and proceed with reassembling our cylinder head. Now another question I get asked about these later model cylinder heads like this is, do you need to lap the valves in them? Now on these particular ones, you can lap them if you see a need in it. Now what I'd be looking for is if you had a lot of excessive carbon buildup on the face, where it had been run that way for an extended period of time, where carbon would actually start chipping away and you'd start getting some uneven spots on the seat area. But on these valves and on the seats, there's no uneven wear or anything. You got a good clean contact surface all the way around. So I'm not going to lap these. Now if it's seen a little bit of pitting or something going on there, I would probably go ahead and lap these. Just don't go overboard with lapping these, because these valves are hard face, which means you can't have these ground, because if you do, you grind right through the hardening, and the material underlying that is of a softer material, and then the valves will prematurely wear and just go right through the seats. So these look good. We're not going to lap these, and we're going to go ahead and put the cylinder head back together. Now I'm going to reassemble the cylinder head, and what I'm going to start out with is I'm going to do the number 1 intake valve. And the reason why I want to do it first, just for demonstration purposes, the intake sides are the ones that have the actual valve guide seal on it. So the first thing you want to do is I put a little bit of Polaris engine oil on the inside of that to kind of lube the lip of the seal there, and we're just going to press that down into place. If you have to, you can take one of your valve springs to kind of help seat it in there all the way, just like that. Next, you want to install the intake valve, and there again I've put a light coating of the Polaris PS4 engine oil on there. So just slide that up into the guide till it pops out just like that. Now we're going to install the valve spring and the retainer. Next, we're going to take our valve spring compression tool. I'm going to set it on the retainer, and I want to turn that tool up to where I can see the top and bottom sides of it, so I can get my keepers in place. And we're just going to work our lever on it to compress the valve spring, just like that. Next, we're going to install the keepers. Now what I like to do is take just a very small amount of grease, just a little dab, to put in there, and that'll help hold those keepers in place until we release the tension on the valve spring compressor. And once you get those keepers in there, then very carefully back that valve spring compressor off and make sure those keepers stay in their grooves, just like that. Then just remove the compressor. Just make sure that both of your keepers are fully seated into the retainer, and there you go. Now we'll go ahead and do all the remaining 3 valves the same way. The only difference being is on the exhaust guides, they're not going to have the seal, they're just going to have this little spring seat plate. I've got the cylinder head completely assembled now, and the last thing I like to do is leak test them. The way I do that is, right now I'm doing the intake valves. I've got the port here full of kerosene, And then basically I'm just going to go down here and I'm going to look at the valves, make sure I don't see any kerosene leaking out there. Yeah, those look really good. I'll do the same thing for the exhaust valves, and then we'll have this cylinder head ready to go. I've got pretty much all the engine parts cleaned up and ready for reassembly, so right now I'm concentrating on the air intake system and some of the fuel injection system components. Now, as I showed you earlier, I showed you where we had a lot of dirt ingestion into the intake side of the air box, and so all I'm doing here is I'm just kind of cleaning up all these components. The throttle body assembly, it's got all that old grit and stuff on the inside of that. We got to get all that stuff cleaned out of there. One of the things I'm doing here is, like on any place that there's a joint in the air intake connection, like this boot here that goes between the air box and the throttle body, you want to take those off and check them. We're going to clean these tubes and thing out because there's, you can see all kinds of grit and stuff in there. We're going to remove the little sensor there. Look at all the dirt and the dust that's on the top side of that O-ring there. You want to be sure and get every little bit of that dirt and grit out of everything in the entire air intake system, or this stuff is going to go right back in the motor. And as a matter of fact, this is the where the boot connection is on the back side of the air box. This little lip right here that you can see all this dust and dirt on, that is on the inside. That dust is hiding in there just waiting to find its way back into the motor. So we want to be sure and clean all those areas up. This is our intake manifold. Look at all that dirt in there. That stuff's got to come out. Even the ends of the fuel injectors themselves. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, look how dirty those are. That's on the back side of the O-rings, on the inside of the intake manifold. So we're going to clean all those components up. I'm just going to use carburetor cleaner and compressed air, clean everything up real good, and then we'll have all this stuff ready to reassemble, and we'll start putting the engine back together. Well, I've got all of our air intake components all cleaned up. And while I was spraying the carburetor cleaner through them, I was kind of holding them over this little bucket that I used to clean small parts in. And I just wanted to kind of collect the carburetor cleaner as it went through those systems so I could see just how much dirt was on the inside of it. Now I've let this settle for a little bit, and I'm going to tip this up here so that you can see just how much dirt came out of the air intake system. Look at that. That was just on the inside of the throttle body, the air box, the intake manifold, and some of the other air intake components. Check that out. It's just kind of amazing how much dirt actually hides in those little places like that. Now we're ready to begin with our engine reassembly. And what we want to start with is our piston rings, and our cylinder assembly. Now normally on most motorcycle and ATV engines, you would normally take your piston, install the piston rings on it, then lubricate it with a little bit of clean engine oil and go ahead and install it with the wrist pin onto the connecting rods, and then you would take your cylinder and kind of ease it down on there. Well, on these engines, since both the pistons both come up at the same time, it's a little more difficult to start two sets of rings at once. So what Polaris recommends that you do is that you pre-install the pistons into the cylinder bores. As a matter of fact, they've got a little cutout on the sides. And what you'll do is you'll assemble it with one of the circlips already installed to the inside. So that way when you set the cylinder down onto the connecting rods, and all you have to do is slide the piston pins in, then install the circlips. Now, something that's a little bit unique on these Polaris pistons that's a little unconventional from most of the motorcycles and ATVs that I've worked on in the past is that these pistons are unidirectional. Now, a lot of your motorcycles and ATVs, the wrist pin has a little bit of offset to one side or the other. Also, normally on the intake and exhaust valves, the reliefs that are cut into the crown of the piston will be smaller on one side or larger on the other to match up with the intake or exhaust valves. On your Polaris pistons, the reliefs are identical. The wrist pin offset is at 0, so it does not matter which way that these pistons go in. But since when you get a piston kit from Polaris, they go ahead and they pre-install the piston rings for you, and they pre-install one of the circlips. So we're going to install these with the circlips facing the inside each other, just like that. Now what we're going to start out with is you want to kind of check your piston rings and make sure that you have your piston ring end gaps staggered, so you don't want them all lined up together. As a matter of fact, they recommend that they're offset by about 120 degrees. So you want to offset your top and your middle. Then also what I'll do is I'll take your two rails of your oil ring, I'll have one on one side and one on the other over here. So all we'll do now is we're going to lubricate the outside of the piston and the rings with clean PS4 Polaris engine oil. We're also going to put a light coating on the inside of the cylinder, and then we're going to install the piston and rings into the cylinders. I've got our cylinders coated with a light coating of the PS4 engine oil, as do the pistons and the rings. So I'm going to take one last look at the piston ring end gaps to make sure they're all staggered properly. And also while I'm installing those, I want to try to make sure that I don't have any of the gaps that fall into these open areas of the cylinder here. That way you stand a little bit less chance of snagging one of them and possibly damaging one of the rings. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna kind of set this down into the bore. Make sure you got your wrist pin to the inside. Set it down to the bore, and I'm just gonna kind of squeeze these rings together. And I'm just gonna kind of rock it a little bit as I go down and ease it down into the bore. Get everything just right. You'll feel each one of those piston rings just kind of work their way on down in there. Just like that. Just kind of take a little time to look around, make sure everything's looking good. Just keep squeezing the rings and working that piston back and forth. Here we go. Once you got it down into the bore, just kind of, you can make sure you can give it a little pressure on it, make sure it slides down into the bore good. That way we know we don't have a ring hung. And we're going to stop right there, then we'll reinstall this piston here. Now I'm just going to make sure I got these pistons pretty much at the same level, so that when we go to put the wrist pins in, both of the pistons line up with the connecting rods. It's looking pretty good right there. Then you want to make sure you got them pretty much squared up with each other, just like that. Now all we have to do is lubricate the wrist pins with a little bit of clean engine oil. And all we have to do is set the block assembly over onto the crankcase. We're going to install the wrist pins and the circlips. Getting ready to install the block and piston assembly now, and as you can see I've already installed the base gasket, and I've put a little PS4 engine oil on the top side of the connecting rods here for the wrist pins. And before I put that block on there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take me a couple of shop towels and I'm going to place them right over the opening, just in case you drop one of your wrist pin keepers while you're installing them. That way maybe it won't fall down into the crankcase. So now I've got our block and piston assembly here. I'll just set that right up there. I'm going to grab me a wrist pin. I'm going to set that on there. Start a wrist pin in one of the pistons. Put it into the rod. Do the same thing with the other side. Just like that. Now I'm going to install the wrist pin keepers, and Polaris recommends that you install them with the opening facing upward at the 12 o'clock position. Once you got your wrist pin keepers installed, verify that you have the gap of the keeper installed in the 12 o'clock position. So now we're ready to go ahead and lower the block and piston assembly on down to the crankcase. So I'm going to remove my towels here. And I'm just going to kind of bump that cylinder on down. Line it up with the crankcase. Just kind of ease it right on down on there onto the dowel pins. Just like that. There we go.